I was born in Toccoa, which is also a Cherokee word for the beautiful. It's a small town, so you see everybody, especially from middle school through high school, almost every day.
Sean Scott grows up as a devout Southern Baptist in the small town in Georgia where his parents meet in 1973.
My mom got pregnant, and they got married out of a sense of obligation to their Christian faith. They got divorced, and my mom met Don the next summer. The gentleman that I call my dad, Don Scott, adopted me in 1981. And I always felt like he dearly loved me. Dad never made me feel any different from the rest of the Scott family.
Don marries Sean's mother, and 8 years later, Sean's half-brother Daniel is born.
When I was very little, Sean and I were very close. He was my childhood hero. Sean was this rock star. Everyone knew who he was, everyone liked him, everyone was always wanting to talk to him. He was on the football team. That was the #1 football team in the state for many years. I wanted to do nothing more than to be Sean.
As he nears his junior year, Sean starts thinking about his future. He has huge aspirations for college, but his mom is an artist, and his stepdad is retired from the Navy.
And both my mom and dad sat me down and said, look, son, we're concerned that if you're going to go to college, you're going to have to figure out how to finance it yourself because we don't have the means to help you. So I started looking for all the schools that had cheap tuition, and then I landed on the United States Military Academy at West Point. And tuition per semester was $0. I'm like, wow, that's going to be easy to afford.
But West Point is the most prestigious military academy in the country and extremely difficult to get into.
So I spent a lot of time from 10th grade on in the guidance counselor's office. That's how I came into Trish Ellis's circle of awareness.
Trish Ellis, a bookkeeper at the school inside the guidance department, is the wife of a prominent pharmacist in town and the mother of Wendy Ellis.
Wendy was very outgoing and friendly, smiling all the time. She was a cheerleader.
I do remember Trish Ellis, Wendy's mother, being very, very much supportive of Sean. I believe that she saw that that would be very promising for her daughter.
Trish stops me one day and says, hey, Sean, Wendy is struggling in algebra. Do you mind tutoring her? And we'll be happy to pay you. I'm like, I'll do that for free. I'll pay you to do that. Wendy pretended to be struggling to learn and not be able to understand it. She would bat her eyes at me, which really excited me. I was just mesmerized by the radiant blue eyes that she had. I really enjoyed the interaction with Wendy.
During the last semester of his senior year, Sean notices that Wendy is absent from school.
I passed Trish's office and I said, hey, Trish, I haven't seen Wendy in school in like 2 weeks. Is she all right? And she says, oh, well, it's pretty sad, but she's in the hospital down near Atlanta for a eating disorder, bulimia, and anorexia.
Sean decides to show support for Wendy and visits her.
When I came in, she looked pitiful. When she saw me, she just lit up. Her eyes got wide. She said, Sean, you came to see me. And that just got me right there. It's probably the initial seed that made me ask her to go with me to our senior prom.
Sean is delighted when Wendy recovers and agrees to go to the prom with him.
The night before my prom, I got home and there was all this paperwork laid out. There's a set of orders with my name on it, and there's instructions to coordinate travel to West Point. I was so relieved. The next afternoon, I picked up Wendy. We took pictures, and then we were off to dinner, and then to the high school gymnasium.
The news of Sean's acceptance into West Point spreads throughout the dance.
Herb and Trish Ellis were chaperones, and they looked like they were overjoyed. Wendy said, "Oh, everyone is so proud of you, and I love you so much." You know, that night, I probably said I love you so that she would kiss me again.
Sean and Wendy grow closer, but once he's at West Point for his freshman year, Sean's schedule is regimented from sunup to sundown.
We were busy. Every time we went to the payphones for the privilege of a very brief phone call, my number one priority was to call Wendy. My second priority was to call my parents.
Wendy tells Sean she is still struggling with her eating disorder, but being in New York makes it hard for him to help her back home in Georgia.
When I was home on leave, Wendy asked me if I would go to one of her psych appointments. I was wholly and consciously aware that Wendy had long-term mental health challenges.
I believe that the protective nature of Sean would draw him to try to help someone like her. She's beautiful, she's well known, the family's well known. She has a problem, so naturally a protective person like that would want to try to shelter that person and help fix them.
At West Point, the years in the calendar seem to fly by, but every day seems like it's an eternity. So, in order to help make the experience tolerable, there are a series of milestone events that include a speech, a ball, a dinner, and one of those is called 500th Night.
The event takes place during Sean's junior year, and Wendy's parents drive her from Georgia to New York to celebrate.
They allowed Wendy and I to have some private time alone. Wendy and I enjoyed a wonderful night, and I was really excited and proud to show off my girlfriend from my hometown. It was just like a night of joy and excitement.
With only one more year till Sean's graduation, the future looks bright if they can get a handle on Wendy's health issues.
One day we were out shopping together, and she just fainted right there in the store. She refused to have an ambulance called. She said that she had diabetes. I had no clue she had diabetes.
Wendy Scott is a very manipulative woman, and she's very dangerous.
She craved attention and affection from others, and she went to any length to get that.
Now I don't know what to believe.
Sean Scott is at West Point when he finds out that his girlfriend Wendy has another serious health complaint.
When I found out that Wendy had diabetes, I was very concerned for her health. She told me that the insulin that she had, she did not get from a doctor. Her father got it from his pharmacy that he worked at and gave it to her. Only once did I actually see her inject herself with insulin. I loved her, and I wanted to be a support to her and to help her in any way that I can.
Sean seemed happy with Wendy. but there was always something about her that made me feel uncomfortable. There was just always that little feeling in me that just made me feel unsure about her.
By Sean's third year at West Point, his relationship with Wendy has evolved. However, he suffers a devastating loss in his family in April 1996 when his stepdad becomes seriously ill.
I made it home on emergency leave from West Point just in time.
I remember Sean opening the door to the ICU in his uniform from West Point and running through the ICU to my father's side. And then I was taken out of the room, but I remember looking back and seeing Sean sitting there holding his hand.
I was holding his hand when he took his last breath. And I held on to it until I felt, the warmth leave.
The next year, Sean's stepdad's absence is felt at his graduation from West Point. But Sean is able to celebrate with Wendy and family.
My mom, my brother, Herb, Trish, Wendy's grandparents came and attended. I was full of pride and exuberance. And people in my hometown that were there, I was going to get to shake hands with the President of the United States. It was just a great day all around.
A few days later, Sean and Wendy drive from New York to Georgia to elope, without family present.
Wendy and I got married in a tiny little chapel on June 3rd, 1997. My best friend Joe was my best man, and he brought along his wife. Wendy was over the top. She acted as if she was about to faint. She did not focus on me. She had a hard time getting through her vows. So that part was kind of bizarre. We had made plans for a honeymoon, and we drove straight through the night to Myrtle Beach, South Carolina. Wendy was not interested in any physical intimacy, and she said that she was feeling physically ill, and that was a great disappointment. But to me, that was not as important as abiding by my vow to love, cherish, and care for her in sickness and in health. I was okay with that because there are higher priorities than my own carnal satisfaction.
A year later, in 1998, after taking the U.S. Army Engineer Officers course, Wendy and Sean moved to Columbia, Georgia, just a few hours from home.
My first permanent duty station in the Army was Fort Benning in Georgia. And we went and did fun things by ourselves and with other people, my West Point classmates included.
Later that year, Hurricane Mitch devastates Central America, and Sean is deployed as part of the Army Corps of Engineers. When Sean returns to Fort Benning, he finds Wendy in a health crisis.
Wendy had gotten a referral to an oncologist because there were some irregularities in her blood work. She told me, "Oh my God, Sean, what if I have cancer?" And then the oncologist broke the news to me that he felt, in his professional opinion, Wendy had leukemia. I couldn't believe it. It was just another shock. I never shaved my own head, but I helped her shave hers. I rarely cried. I definitely cried tears that dripped on her head while I was helping her shave it. She was so grateful, and we had intimate contact that we hadn't had in months or maybe even in years at that point.
Wendy tells Sean that she wants to do the treatments on her own, so as not to distract him from his work.
She said, "I've found a specialist that can treat me right here at the hospital. You can just drop me off in the morning, and then I'll find a ride home." While she was going to chemotherapy, there was less strange behavior, and all the other antics faded away.
Wendy starts her treatment, and Sean believes that all is going well, until one day, he is summoned to a meeting with some other Army spouses at Fort Benning.
It was a historic home of a colonel, and Wendy was sitting there, and she looked up at me, had a very nervous look on her face, and was very fidgety. You could hear a pin drop. One of the spouses said, "We have discovered that Wendy does not really have cancer. She's been lying to us, and we've all been deeply hurt by this." I couldn't say anything. I was filled with rage.
Second Lieutenant Sean Scott has been told by a group of Army spouses that his wife Wendy is faking having cancer.
I was just devastated, embarrassed. I felt sick to my stomach. I couldn't say anything except thank you for bringing this to my attention. I am so sorry that this happened. I learned that one of the church community saw her at the hospital. She just walked around like a normal person, and she wasn't behaving like she would behave at church, where she would present as if she was deathly ill and unable to perform activities of daily living on her own and needed help.
But how did Wendy trick her oncologist into a leukemia diagnosis?
I was finally coming to grips with an escalating pattern of behavior. I believe Wendy figured out how to manipulate her body so that her blood work came back such that more than one medical provider was convinced that she had leukemia.
He had worked very hard to get to where he was, and he had a very promising career ahead of him. The situation that she put them in could very much damage his entire career.
I was committed to her because I considered marriage my bond with Wendy and with God. And I wasn't going to give up on that, and I was determined not to get a divorce. I decided that I was going to monitor and control her behavior as best I could.
For the next 2 years, Sean focuses on the demands of his career and spends less and less time with Wendy. In April of 2002, he is notified that Wendy is in the ER because of a complication related to her diabetes.
The physician on call was present. After the whole cancer thing, I knew from then on that she was faking. She found some new docs who didn't know her backstory. I said, "Look, doc, I respect what you do, and I just want you to know that I know without a shadow of a doubt that my wife does not have diabetes. Never had." He paused, looked at me in the eyes for a second and said, "Okay, would you like for me to put her on a 72-hour hold?" I came in and told her she was going to a psych ward, and she was livid. She was throwing objects at me. She was yelling at me.
And Wendy has one more bomb to drop.
A nurse came in and said, "We got your blood results. Wendy was pregnant."
On December 13th, 2002, Sean and Wendy's daughter is born with hydrocephalus, a condition that will require multiple surgeries.
When our daughter was born, Wendy's behaviors regarding her own health just disappeared. It was like magic. I found out that I was deploying. I was amped and energized and excited to exercise my leadership in the role of company commander.
Sean is deployed to Kuwait, but gets emergency medical leave to return to the U.S. in March 2004.
I was back in the States in Chapel Hill, North Carolina for the first of a series of brain surgeries for our daughter at a UNC Medical Center. My personal belief is that the hydrocephalus condition, which was diagnosed as Chiari malformation, was congenital. In 2004, my daughter began developing symptoms from vomiting to abnormal eating behavior to constant diarrhea.
Sean is now stationed at Fort Detrick, Maryland, so that the family can be close to Walter Reed Medical Center, where their daughter is a frequent visitor.
The doctors were unsure as to what exactly was wrong. They were pursuing the option of leukemia, and they were doing everything that they could to help her.
Over the next 3 years, Sean and Wendy pull closer together. Wendy is no longer faking health issues and gives birth to a son who is underweight but otherwise healthy. At Walter Reed, the doctors cannot determine the cause of Sean's daughter's ongoing symptoms.
My daughter underwent hundreds of diagnostic procedures. The spinal tap, that's an extremely painful procedure, and it was gut-wrenching, heartbreaking to be present and in the room with her.
In June of 2007, Sean gets a call from Wendy.
There's going to be a multidisciplinary team meeting. So all the specialists, along with the primary care manager, meet in a room with the parents, and one of the lead GI physicians laid a bombshell. There are levels of magnesium in your daughter's system that I cannot account for. So that tells me that either you pointing at me or you pointing at Wendy or both of you have been giving your daughter magnesium of some form. And Wendy confessed on the spot. I did it, and I looked at her in front of all these people. All I could say was, how could you?
The place that you have to be mentally to do something like that to an innocent little child, you would have to be.
Sean Scott's 4-year-old daughter has undergone dozens of medical procedures for various health issues since her birth. His wife Wendy has now admitted to poisoning her. The state takes custody of the Scott children.
Anger doesn't even come close. It's more like rage. I was shocked, stunned, sickened, saddened. I drove Wendy home, and she cried, and she blabbered on to me about how we still have to stick together as a family. I just looked at her and I was like, will you shut up? Or I was going to wreck the car and kill both of us.
In June 2007, I received a call from Fort Detrick advising me that they had just received a call from Walter Reed and they believed they had a child abuse case. They advised that the mother of the child had been confronted by the doctor and actually admitted that she had been poisoning her child and that she was withdrawing blood from the child as well. I knew about Munchausen by proxy, what they call it today, fictitious disorder by proxy. And immediately it triggered into my mind that I may have one of those cases. In a Munchausen by proxy case, the person themselves is Munchausen. And they cause their own illnesses or injuries to gain attention. And normally it's when they can't get attention for themselves anymore that they move on to a child.
Agent Smith calls FBI headquarters to talk to a profiler.
I knew that I was going to have to approach this interview differently. The behavioral analysis profiler told me to make the interview completely about her, to not talk about her children and the things that she did to the child, but to talk about how it affected her and how it made her feel. Just focus the entire interview on Wendy. I walked in, the chaplain was there, and Wendy Scott was there. You're expecting a monster, but in fact, she actually looks like a little child herself. She comes across very innocent, very naive, someone that you want to protect. Wendy showed absolutely no remorse during the interview. I realized that I did in fact have a Munchausen by proxy case, that she was truly injuring her child to gain attention for herself. And so my goal at that point was to get as much evidence as I could. I was able to get consent from Wendy to search the house. The home that the Scotts lived in was in a very nice area. The house was very organized and clean. Similarly, so was the victim child's bedroom. It was a beautiful bedroom. It looked like she cared very deeply for this child by the way that the room was presented. I spoke to the team leader of our evidence response team that went directly to the kitchen trash can. And sure enough, at the top of the trash can was a large bottle of milk and magnesia. And I saw a red hazmat box, the type you find in a doctor's office where you put expended syringes in. And inside were 5 syringes with blood in them. I actually took the photo books to see if they told any type of story. I was able to see things such as the child had straight hair. And I saw that Wendy had taken pictures of this victim child when she was putting curlers in her hair. I later interviewed the doctors at Walter Reed. They all described her as looking like Shirley Temple, who had curly hair. She wanted her daughter to look adorable and all the doctors to fall in love with her, to be the cutest kid on the floor, if you will. Wendy would do the child's hair in advance the night before, and then she would do something to the child to induce the symptoms that resulted in her bringing the child to the hospital. So it showed premeditation. I did learn through my investigation that Wendy herself had feigned illness at a previous space. She claimed she had leukemia, she was in a wheelchair, she'd shaved her head, she even shaved her eyebrows, literally had everyone absolutely convinced that she had it. She figured out a way to cause those type of symptoms in herself, and she was trying to do the same thing to her daughter.
Sean must now prove he is a fit parent to regain custody of his children.
I had a court date immediately. I had to hire my own attorney.
It was really devastating to him. But he picked himself up and began to make sure the children had a stable, safe place to be.
The evidence, timing, and Sean's record of conduct eventually exonerate him from suspicion.
Sean Scott had been serving his country, only to find that the enemy was not abroad. The enemy was in his own household, nearly killing his child. When the victim and the younger sibling were in Sean Scott's custody, they immediately started improving. The symptoms that the child presented with at Walter Reed Medical Center never, ever recurred.
After convincing a judge that I was a fit parent, I got legal custody of my children.
The case goes from FBI jurisdiction during the investigation to Maryland state prosecutors as they prepare for an indictment.
Agent Smith reviewed with me the information she received from Dr. Delormier, the attending physician at Walter Reed Medical Center. This woman was causing her child a near-death medical condition. The symptoms progressed to dramatic blood loss to the point where on 3 different occasions that the child had to be transfused. Dr. Delormier testified that the child could very well have died with the amount of blood that was taken from her system. It was dangerous enough that as a prosecutor, I had to make sure that she never had contact with that child again, with her younger child, or with any child. That was my focus.
On November 16, 2007, Wendy Scott is indicted on 15 charges.
She was charged with at least 2 counts of first-degree child abuse, second-degree child abuse, first-degree assault, second-degree assault, and reckless endangerment.
On March 13, 2008, Wendy Scott pleads guilty to first-degree child abuse.
In exchange for dismissing the remaining counts, the defense agreed that at sentencing, the parties would be free to argue as to what the appropriate sentence would be.
Wendy's sentencing hearing takes place 2 months later.
When she first came into court, she was just fluttering around, smiling, talking to people. It was clear she wanted to be the center of attention. But she did not testify during the sentencing hearing. The state presented testimony principally from Dr. Delormier. He was so incensed by this whole incident and what that child had suffered. Because of the blood loss levels, the myriad of tests that she had had to undergo, the radiology she was subjected to, his testimony went to the permanency of the injury to that young victim. The defense, they were arguing that she didn't intend to hurt the child. The only reason she was doing it was because of her own mental disorder. She had been diagnosed with a borderline personality disorder. One of the manifestations of that was the fictitious disorder and fictitious disorder by proxy. But she knew that the blood she was withdrawing was causing the child to be transfused at least 3 times. And for her to say that she didn't know that what she was doing was causing harm is just not defensible.
Concerned that Wendy will present a further risk to her daughter if she gets a light sentence, the prosecution presents surprising evidence that her disorder is deeply rooted. Even while on bail, Wendy had been exhibiting classic fictitious disorder behaviors.
She decided to get a job, and while she was there, I discovered that she was faking cancer and diabetes. She would go on her lunch break and sit in her car on a 90+ degree day, and then passing out, and that the ambulance would be called. She submits a request to this employer requesting time off, saying that she had lymphoma and that she needed to go for chemo on a weekly basis.
She was engaging in this very type of behavior, even at a time where she was participating in counseling and under the supervision of a psychiatric professional. She was doing this again.
This revelation seals Wendy's fate with the judge.
The judge sentenced her to 15 years of active incarceration and 5 years of supervised probation.
I had finally come to the realization that she was never going to stop doing this.
Sean takes off his wedding ring, files for divorce, and visits Wendy in jail one last time.
Within a couple of seconds of visiting her, and she looked down and she held my hand and she said, "Why did you take off your ring? Someone will fall in love with you. You can't do that." So I was just like, "I'm sorry." And she's like, "I think you need to go."
After 11 years of trauma, Sean is free to find love with a new partner and discovers there is light at the end of the tunnel.
My brother and Sean worked together at Walter Reed. We were both going through divorces about the same time, and we were friends. I wanted to help Sean primarily because I knew what a wonderful man he was. As a mother, it's an overwhelming story to hear. It still hurts to this day. And I felt terrible for him because it was a lot. And as a mom, like, our kids are close in age, so it really hit home. Our friendship grew more and more. Once his divorce was final, it was like an instant connection. Sean's children needed a lot of healing and love and support due to the damage that was caused by Wendy Scott.
In 2010, Sean and Rachel marry and blend their families. Rachel becomes the loving and protective mother Sean's kids have never known.
While Sean was deployed to Afghanistan, Wendy submitted a request for reconsideration. She wanted to reduce her prison time, and we feel that she coordinated that request in knowing that Sean was in Afghanistan, and so they attended that request. It was probably the most terrifying day of my life because I really didn't want to see Wendy in person, but I was also proud to speak on the kid's behalf because he was obviously not able to be there.
For the first time since her arrest, Wendy takes the stand.
You start by telling him your name.
Wendy Michelle Scott.
You have any children?
Yes, I do.
She obviously presented a very positive picture of her accomplishments.
Do you currently believe you're a danger to the community?
No, I am not.
Not one mention was made about the child. She knew that her counseling would not be successful if she was not able to be honest. So I asked her, tell me what you did to your daughter.
Miss Scott, could you tell us please what you did?
And she was very taken aback by that. The defense, of course, objected to it, and the judge wanted to hear the answer too. She hemmed and she hawed.
Miss Angel, I am not a doctor. I cannot honestly, under oath, say that I know exactly what I did to her. I don't know.
And I don't think she ever really did answer my question. I just said, I have nothing more. I don't have any more questions.
And then I read a victim impact statement. She works hard every single day of her life to try to be a typical kid. She will be scarred forever. It is something that we will deal with for the rest of her life. And part of that was I had said that his daughter had her feeding tube removed, and as I was saying that, there was a cheer from Wendy, like, yay! Thank goodness I had the DA and the FBI agent on both sides of me because I think I would have done something mean. She did this to her daughter, and I'm the one that, along with Sean, we got rid of it and reached that milestone together. The damage and the harm that she did to an innocent little girl is just baffling. I think it's evil.
Ms. Scott, that sentence I imposed then is appropriate, and it remains appropriate. You nearly killed her, and your motion to modify is denied.
Wendy loses the appeal for a shortened sentence and serves her full term.
Sean and the kids are in a much better place. We all had to do the hard work together as a family. One of my proudest moments was to be by his side when he was promoted to lieutenant colonel because his career was almost destroyed because of Wendy. All 4 kids were at the ceremony, and of course, I cried. But it was just a very special day.
Sean is a proud and intensely private man, but he tells his story to warn others.
I'm at peace with it now. I'm okay. I cherish and appreciate the love and support that my wife and my children and my extended family and all my friends have given me to be able to get to the point. My purpose and mission will be to help somebody out there who's doubting themselves. Take action, don't hesitate, seek help. If you got doubts or questions, talk to somebody.
Sean is joyful in his new life and has high hopes for the future of his children.
They're strong, resilient children. I'm very proud of them. They're going to go on to do great things in their own right out there.
On a warm summer morning in Mesa, Arizona, a quiet suburban neighborhood woke up like any other day. The sun climbed above the desert landscape, casting golden light over the streets where families lived ordinary lives, where people left for work, where neighbors exchanged simple greetings, and where nothing seemed unusual. But behind one closed door, inside a house that once represented independence, ambition, and hope, a horrifying discovery was waiting. The home belonged to Travis Victor Alexander. To many people, Travis was the kind of person who seemed impossible to forget. He was the man who smiled easily, who remembered names, who encouraged others when they doubted themselves. He was someone who had built friendships everywhere he went and who had a talent for making people feel important. At only 30 years old, Travis had already created a life that many people dreamed of. He had a successful career, strong connections within his community, and plans for a future that appeared full of possibilities. He was not someone who expected his life to end violently inside his own home. He was not someone who believed that a person he once loved would become the center of the darkest chapter of his existence. But on June 4, 2008, something happened inside that house in Mesa that would transform a private relationship into one of the most infamous criminal cases in modern American history. A relationship that began with excitement, attraction, and promises of happiness would eventually become a story of obsession, jealousy, betrayal, and death. At the center of this tragedy was a woman named Jodi Arias. For years, the world would debate one question. How could a relationship that once seemed filled with passion end in such unimaginable violence? The answer would emerge slowly, piece by piece, through photographs, messages, memories, and courtroom testimony. But before the accusations, before the trial cameras focused on every expression and every word, there was a man named Travis Alexander. And his story deserves to begin there. Travis was born in 1977 and grew up facing challenges that shaped his personality. Those who knew him described him as someone who learned resilience early in life. He understood the value of hard work, personal improvement, and building meaningful relationships. As an adult, Travis became a successful salesperson in the legal services industry. His career required confidence, communication skills, and the ability to connect with people. These were qualities that came naturally to him. He was not simply someone who sold a product. He was someone who inspired others. Friends remembered him as a person who constantly pushed himself to become better. He enjoyed motivational speaking, personal development, and sharing ideas that encouraged people to improve their own lives. Within the Mormon community in Arizona, Travis became known as an energetic and committed member. His faith was an important part of his identity, influencing many of the choices he made and the type of future he wanted to build. He dreamed of marriage. He dreamed of stability. He dreamed of finding someone who would stand beside him as he continued creating the life he imagined. And then, in September 2006, Travis met Jodi Arias. At the time, neither of them could have understood how significant that meeting would become. They met at a company conference in Las Vegas. Jodi was 26 years old and working as a freelance photographer. She was described as creative, independent, and someone who was searching for direction in her life. When Travis and Jodi first encountered each other, there was an immediate connection. Their conversations became longer. Their messages became more frequent. Their interest in each other grew stronger. What began as a simple introduction quickly developed into an intense relationship. To outsiders, it appeared romantic. Two people discovering each other. Two people sharing dreams. Two people who seemed fascinated by one another. Jodie became deeply involved in Travis's world. She spent more time with him, learned about his beliefs, and eventually became connected to the same religious community that was important to Travis. Their relationship moved quickly. They traveled together. They shared personal moments. They created memories that, years later, would become evidence in a murder investigation. But beneath the surface, there were already signs that their relationship was not as simple as it appeared. Travis and Jodie wanted different things. Travis was beginning to think about the future. He wanted a relationship that aligned with his values and long-term goals. Jodie, however, seemed to have a different vision of what their connection meant. By 2007, Travis decided that the relationship could not continue in the same way. He ended their romantic relationship. But the ending was not clean. Some relationships disappear after a breakup. This one did not. Travis and Jodie continued communicating. They continued seeing each other. They continued sharing parts of their lives. The emotional connection remained complicated. And that complexity would become one of the most important elements in understanding what happened later. To Travis, the relationship may have been something from his past that he was trying to move beyond. To Jodie, investigators would later argue, the relationship was something she could not accept losing. As Travis moved forward, he began focusing on his future. He spent time with friends, worked toward his goals, and continued building his life. But according to people close to him, Jodie struggled with the idea of Travis moving on. Friends later described moments when Travis appeared uncomfortable with certain behaviors. They claimed he had concerns about Jodie's jealousy and the intensity of her emotions. The warning signs were subtle. They were not the kind of things that immediately predict a tragedy. Many people experience difficult breakups. Many people struggle with rejection. Many people feel jealousy after losing someone they love. But sometimes, behind ordinary emotions, something darker can develop. A desire to control. A refusal to accept separation. An inability to let go. The prosecution would later argue that this was the path Jodie Arias followed. They claimed that the loss of Travis's affection became more than heartbreak. It became an obsession. And as Travis continued moving toward a future without her, the tension between them grew. On June 4, 2008, Travis's life was still moving forward. He had plans. He had responsibilities. He had people who cared about him. That day, Jodie arrived at his home in Mesa. No one around them knew it would be the final time Travis Alexander would be seen alive. No one knew that the photographs taken inside that house would later become some of the most important evidence in a murder investigation. No one knew that a private relationship between two people would soon become a national obsession. Several days later, Travis would fail to appear at an important event. Friends became concerned. They knew Travis as someone reliable, someone who would not simply disappear. Their concern grew into fear. And when people entered his home, they discovered a scene that would shock everyone who knew him. The man who had spent his life encouraging others was gone. The person who had smiled through difficulties was found dead inside his own bathroom. The investigation that followed would reveal a brutal attack. It would reveal secrets hidden inside a complicated relationship. It would reveal a trail of evidence that led investigators back to one person. Jodie Arias. But before the world knew her name as a suspect, she had been someone Travis cared about. Someone he trusted. someone who had once been welcomed into his life. And that is what made the case so disturbing. The greatest danger did not come from a stranger hiding in the shadows. It came from someone who had once been close enough to know his dreams, his habits, and the place he called home. The story of Travis Alexander is not only about how he died. It is about who he was before that moment. A friend. A son. A person with ambitions and hopes. A man whose future was taken away in a matter of minutes. And as investigators began uncovering the truth behind his final days, they would discover that the photographs, the messages, and the memories left behind would tell a story far more complicated than anyone expected. A story about love. A story about obsession. And a story about how a relationship that began with attraction ended with a crime that shocked an entire nation. Mesa, Arizona, is a city shaped by contrasts. Located in the heart of the Sonoran Desert, it is a place where endless skies stretch above quiet neighborhoods, where the landscape is painted with shades of sand, cactus, and sunlight. For many residents, Mesa represents stability. It is a place where people build homes, raise families, pursue careers, and search for the kind of peaceful life that seems impossible to find in larger, more chaotic cities. In many ways, Travis Alexander's life reflected the image of Mesa itself. He was building. He was growing. He was looking toward the future. His home was not a place of fear. It was a place where he invited friends, shared conversations, laughed with people he cared about, and imagined the years ahead. To those who knew him, Travis was not just another resident of an Arizona neighborhood. He was a familiar face. A person whose energy filled a room. A person who could turn a simple conversation into something meaningful. But beneath the peaceful appearance of the community, a hidden emotional storm was developing. A relationship that had started with excitement and affection was slowly becoming complicated, filled with unanswered questions, emotional conflicts, and feelings that neither Travis nor Jody fully understood at the time. The story of Travis Alexander and Jody Arias did not begin with violence. It began in a moment that looked ordinary. Two people meeting. Two people becoming interested in each other. Two people believing they had found something special. That is what makes the tragedy so unsettling. The most devastating moments in life often do not announce themselves. They begin quietly. They begin with normal conversations. With ordinary decisions. With people believing tomorrow will look exactly like today. In 2006, Travis was living a life that many people admired. He had established himself professionally and socially. His work required him to meet new people, communicate effectively, and inspire confidence. He was naturally outgoing, and his personality made it easy for others to approach him. Friends often described Travis as someone who carried himself with optimism. He was the person who encouraged others to chase their goals. The person who talked about improvement and personal responsibility. The person who believed that people could change their lives if they were willing to work for it. That belief was one of the reasons people were drawn to him. Travis was ambitious, but he was also deeply connected to the people around him. His friendships were important. His faith was important. His vision for the future was important. He was not simply looking for temporary happiness. He wanted something lasting. A stable career. A loving marriage. A family. A life built around the principles he valued. And when Jody Arias entered his world, she appeared to fit into that vision. At first, their connection seemed effortless. Jody brought excitement into Travis's life. She was creative, independent, and different from many people he had known before. Her background in photography gave her a unique perspective. She noticed details. She captured moments. She had a way of making ordinary experiences feel meaningful. For Travis, that attention may have been appealing. For Jody, Travis represented many things she admired. He was confident. He was respected. He was socially successful. He had direction. He appeared to know exactly where he was going. Their attraction grew quickly. Messages became conversations. Conversations became emotional attachments. The distance between two strangers disappeared. Soon, Travis and Jody were spending more time together, sharing personal stories and becoming part of each other's daily routines. Their relationship developed during a period when both of them seemed to be searching for something. Travis wanted companionship and a future partner. Jody wanted connection and belonging. At least in the beginning, they appeared to find those things in each other. But relationships are not built only on attraction. They are also built on expectations. And slowly, the expectations between Travis and Jody began moving in different directions. Travis saw certain boundaries. Jody saw a deeper emotional connection. Travis believed the relationship had limits. Jody appeared to believe those limits could change. This difference would become the foundation of the conflict that followed. After their breakup in 2007, the physical distance between them increased, but the emotional connection remained. They were no longer officially a couple. But they were not completely separated either. They continued communicating. They continued meeting. They continued returning to the same relationship that had already shown signs of instability. For Travis, this situation may have seemed like a way to remain kind while moving forward. For Jody, investigators would later argue, it created hope that the relationship could be restored. And hope can become dangerous when reality does not match expectations. As months passed, Travis continued building his life. He spent time with friends. He focused on his career. He talked about the future. But Jody remained connected to him. She knew his routines. She knew his personality. She knew the places he went and the people important to him. That familiarity would later become one of the most disturbing elements of the case. Because the person who would eventually become the center of the investigation was not a stranger. She was someone who had once been welcomed. Someone who had shared private moments with him. Someone who knew the man behind the public image. In the months before Travis's death, some of his friends began noticing changes. They noticed tension. They noticed uncomfortable moments. They noticed that the relationship between Travis and Jody did not appear completely peaceful. According to testimony later presented in court, Travis sometimes expressed concerns about Jody's behavior. Friends claimed he felt that she could become jealous and emotionally intense. They said he was trying to create distance. But the connection between them continued. And this is where the story becomes more complicated. Human relationships rarely follow simple patterns. People can recognize problems and still remain connected. They can feel uncomfortable and still care. They can know something is unhealthy and still struggle to walk away. Travis was not living in a movie where every decision was obvious. He was a real person dealing with complicated emotions. He had memories with Jody. He had feelings for her. And despite concerns, he did not completely remove her from his life. Meanwhile, Jody's attachment appeared to grow stronger. The breakup that Travis considered a decision became, in Jody's eyes, something she continued fighting against. The future Travis imagined without her became something she struggled to accept. The emotional distance between them became larger. But the connection remained. And inside that contradiction was the beginning of the tragedy. By early 2008, Travis Alexander was still focused on the future. He continued working. He continued making plans. He continued living as though the next chapter of his life was waiting for him. He had no way of knowing that one of the people closest to him would soon become linked to his death. He had no way of knowing that his private life would become public. That strangers across the country would analyze his messages, his relationships, and his final moments. That his name would become permanently connected to one of America's most controversial murder trials. The house in Mesa where Travis lived would soon become known around the world. But before it became a crime scene, it was simply his home. A place filled with ordinary memories. A place where friends had visited. A place where he had laughed. A place where he believed he was safe. And that is what makes what happened there so difficult to understand. The danger did not arrive from outside. It did not come from an unknown person. It came from a relationship that had already existed inside his life. As investigators would later reconstruct the events leading to June 4, 2008, they would discover that the story was not simply about a murder. It was about a relationship that slowly changed. A connection that became unhealthy. A love story that transformed into a tragedy. And before the world learned about the crime, before cameras filled the courtroom, before millions of people followed every detail of the case, there was still one important question. Who was Travis Alexander before he became a victim? Because to understand the tragedy, we must first understand the man whose life was taken away, before his name appeared in newspapers, before his story became part of one of the most closely followed murder trials in America. Travis Victor Alexander was simply a man trying to build a meaningful life. He was not a headline. He was not a courtroom exhibit. He was not a photograph shown on television screens across the country. He was Travis. A friend. A brother. A son. A person with dreams, weaknesses, ambitions, and hopes for the future. And perhaps the most important thing to understand about this case is that Travis Alexander was more than the circumstances surrounding his death. He was someone who had spent years creating connections with people around him. Someone who believed that life was about improvement, faith, relationships, and becoming a better version of himself. Those who knew Travis often spoke about his personality before anything else. They remembered his smile. They remembered his confidence. They remembered the way he could walk into a room and immediately make people feel noticed. There are many victims in true crime stories whose lives become reduced to the final moments of their existence. A date. A location. A crime scene. A photograph. But Travis Alexander's life was not defined by June 4, 2008. His life was defined by everything that came before. The conversations. The friendships. The goals. The small moments that showed who he really was. Travis was born in 1977 and experienced challenges early in life that shaped the person he would become. Those who knew him understood that he was not someone who simply accepted circumstances. He believed people could overcome difficult situations. He believed personal choices mattered. He believed that the future could be changed through determination and effort. That mindset followed him into adulthood. Travis became someone who constantly searched for growth. He read. He learned. He surrounded himself with people who motivated him. He wanted to become successful, but success for Travis was not only about money or recognition. It was about becoming someone respected. Someone dependable. Someone who could make a difference in the lives of others. His career reflected those qualities. Working in sales for a legal services company required communication, confidence, and the ability to understand people. For many people, sales can feel cold or impersonal. But Travis approached it differently. He enjoyed connecting with others. He enjoyed conversations. He enjoyed helping people understand opportunities. His personality became one of his greatest strengths. People were naturally drawn to him. He had a way of making strangers feel comfortable. A simple conversation with Travis could quickly become a deeper discussion about goals, faith, relationships, and personal improvement. That ability also made him influential within his religious community. Travis was part of the Mormon community in Arizona, where he developed strong friendships and became known as someone passionate about his beliefs. His faith was not simply a label. It influenced his choices. It influenced how he viewed relationships. It influenced the kind of future he wanted. For Travis, the idea of family was extremely important. He dreamed of marriage. He dreamed of having children. He dreamed of creating a home filled with love and stability. Friends later described him as someone who often talked about finding the right person to share his life with. He was not searching only for romance. He was searching for a partner. Someone who would walk beside him. Someone who shared his values. Someone who wanted the same future. This desire for commitment would become one of the most important elements in understanding his relationship with Jodi Arias. Because while their connection began with attraction and excitement, they did not appear to be moving toward the same destination. At the beginning, however, Travis saw something special in Jodi. When they met in Las Vegas in 2006, he was introduced to someone who seemed interesting and different. Jodi was creative. She was artistic. She had a personality that stood out. She was a photographer who looked at the world through images and emotions. For Travis, there was something intriguing about her. Their conversations developed quickly. They shared experiences. They laughed together. They created memories. To people observing from the outside, they appeared to be another couple discovering each other. But relationships often contain realities that outsiders never see. Behind closed doors, two people can experience the same relationship in completely different ways. One person may see a temporary connection. Another may see a lifelong bond. One person may believe a chapter is ending. Another may believe the story is only beginning. This difference in perception would later become central to the investigation. As Travis became more serious about his future, he began evaluating his relationship with Jodi. He cared about her. But he also recognized that they were not necessarily compatible in the way he wanted. The decision to end the romantic relationship was not easy. Breakups rarely are. Even when two people know something is not working, emotions remain. Memories remain. Attachment remains. And that was exactly what happened between Travis and Jodi. They separated, but they did not disappear from each other's lives. They continued communicating. They continued meeting. They continued sharing personal moments. To Travis, this may have felt like maintaining a connection with someone who had been important to him. But to investigators, the continued contact would later represent something different. They believed it allowed Jodi to remain emotionally attached to a relationship that Travis was trying to leave behind. The people closest to Travis began noticing that the situation was becoming complicated. Friends later testified that Travis sometimes discussed his concerns. They described moments when he appeared frustrated or uncomfortable. They believed he was trying to establish boundaries. But Travis was also someone who cared about people. He was not the kind of person who easily discarded relationships. He believed in forgiveness. He believed in giving people chances. Those qualities made him admired by many. But they may also have made it difficult for him to completely separate himself from a situation that was becoming increasingly unhealthy. The tragedy of Travis Alexander is not that he failed to see danger in some dramatic movie-like moment. Real life rarely works that way. Sometimes danger appears slowly. Sometimes warning signs are mixed with good memories. Sometimes people we once trusted become people we no longer understand. And Travis was dealing with a complicated human relationship, not a clear enemy. In the months before his death, Travis continued living the life he had built. He continued working. He continued spending time with friends. He continued planning his future. He was still the same person people described as energetic and optimistic. He still laughed. He still helped others. He still believed there were good things ahead. That is why the news of his death shocked those who knew him. For many of his friends, the idea that Travis was gone felt impossible. The person who had always seemed full of life had suddenly disappeared. The future he had talked about would never happen. The goals he had worked toward would remain unfinished. The conversations he planned to have would never take place. A person who had spent so much time encouraging others would never have the opportunity to encourage anyone again. And as investigators began examining the final days of his life, they would slowly uncover the complicated relationship that surrounded him. They would look at messages. They would examine photographs. They would interview friends. They would reconstruct moments that had once seemed private. And through that process, the world would learn more about Travis Alexander. Not just how he died, but who he was. A man who wanted love. A man who wanted family. A man who believed in second chances. A man who opened his life to someone he trusted. The tragedy was not only that Travis Alexander was murdered. The tragedy was that he was killed at a moment when he believed his life was still moving forward. He was 30 years old. He had dreams waiting ahead of him. He had people who loved him. He had a future he never got to experience. And soon, the question would no longer be about the life Travis built. It would become about the final hours of that life. The moments inside his home. The person who was with him. And the horrifying events that transformed an ordinary day in Mesa, Arizona, into a crime that would capture the attention of an entire nation. On the morning of June 4, 2008, Travis Alexander woke up like any other day. The world around him continued moving normally. In Mesa, Arizona, people went to work. Cars traveled through familiar streets. Neighbors continued their routines without knowing that behind the walls of a quiet home, a tragedy was approaching. For Travis, it was another day filled with responsibilities and plans. He was 30 years old. He had a career to build. Friends to meet. Goals to accomplish. A future he believed was still waiting for him. There was nothing about that morning that suggested it would become the final day of his life. Nothing that warned him that the person who would enter his home would later become the focus of a murder investigation. The person was Jodi Arias. At one point, Jodi had represented excitement and possibility. She was someone Travis had met during a period when both of them seemed interested in finding a meaningful connection. She was someone who had shared private moments with him. Someone who had laughed with him. Someone who knew parts of his life that many others did not. But by June 2008, their relationship had changed. The romance that once brought them together had become complicated. Their connection existed somewhere between the past and the present. They were no longer officially a couple. Yet they were not complete strangers. There were still conversations. Still meetings. Still moments when the boundary between friendship and something more became unclear. And that uncertainty would become one of the most important pieces of the story. According to investigators, Jodi traveled to Mesa on June 4 and went to Travis's home. The reason for the visit would later become a major point of debate. The prosecution would argue that Jodi had gone there with a plan. The defense would argue that something unexpected happened. Two completely different versions of the same day would eventually be presented in court. But before the courtroom battles, there was only one thing that mattered. Travis Alexander was alive when Jodi arrived. The last known moments of Travis's life were captured through a series of photographs from a digital camera. At first glance, the images appeared ordinary. They showed two people together. They showed private moments. They showed a relationship that, from the outside, still appeared intimate. But years later, those same photographs would become some of the most important evidence in one of America's most famous murder trials. Investigators would carefully examine every detail. The timestamps. The sequence of images. The condition of the camera. The moments before everything changed. The photographs created a timeline. A timeline that placed Travis and Jody together inside the home before the attack. After the photographs, investigators believe Travis moved toward the bathroom area. And somewhere during that period, the situation turned violent. The exact events inside that house became the center of the investigation. What happened next was not a sudden accident. It was a violent attack that would leave investigators struggling to understand how a personal relationship could end in such brutality. Travis Alexander suffered multiple stab wounds. He was also shot. His throat was cut. The injuries revealed a level of violence that shocked even experienced investigators. This was not a crime scene that suggested a random confrontation. To many investigators, it appeared deeply personal. The person responsible had not simply wanted Travis gone. The attack showed intense anger and aggression. It suggested an emotional connection between the victim and the person who had killed him. Because the most disturbing part of the case was not only the violence. It was the closeness between the victim and the person accused of taking his life. Travis was not attacked by someone who had never known him. The person investigators would eventually accuse was someone who knew his personality. Someone who knew his home. Someone who knew his daily life. Someone who had once been invited into his world. That detail changed the entire nature of the investigation. When a stranger commits a crime, investigators often search outward. They look for unknown threats. They examine outside connections. They follow unfamiliar patterns. But when someone close becomes the suspect, the investigation becomes far more complicated. Every memory must be reconsidered. Every interaction must be examined. Every moment of trust becomes a possible clue. And that was exactly what happened with Travis and Jody. After the attack, Travis's body remained inside his home. For several days, no one immediately knew what had happened. His friends expected to hear from him. They expected him to answer messages. They expected him to appear at the events and meetings he had planned. Because that was who Travis was. Reliable. Committed. Someone people could count on. His absence became unusual. Then it became concerning. Friends began realizing that something was wrong. The man who normally stayed connected with people had suddenly disappeared. The silence was impossible to ignore. On June 9, 5 days after Travis was killed, concern turned into fear. Friends went to his home to check on him. They entered expecting to find an explanation. Maybe Travis had become sick. Maybe something had happened that delayed him. Maybe there was a simple reason he had not responded. But what they discovered inside the house was something no friend should ever have to see. Travis Alexander was dead. The bathroom where investigators found him became the place where a private tragedy became a criminal investigation. The home that once represented his independence and success was transformed into a crime scene. Every detail suddenly mattered. Every object. Every mark. Every piece of evidence. Investigators immediately recognized that this was not a normal death. The injuries told them that Travis had been violently attacked. The scene suggested that the person responsible had a connection to him. Someone had been inside his home. Someone had been close enough to reach him. Someone had been trusted. And as police began gathering information, they started looking into Travis's relationships. They spoke with friends. They examined his recent interactions. They tried to understand what had been happening in his life before his death. One name quickly became impossible to ignore. Jodi Arias. The woman who had once been part of Travis's life. The woman who had been romantically involved with him. The woman who had been inside his home shortly before his death. At first, the investigation was still developing. Police did not immediately know the entire story. They did not know every detail of what happened in those final minutes. They did not yet understand every motive. But they knew one thing. The answer was connected to the relationship between Travis and Jodi. The investigation would soon reveal a series of discoveries that would change everything. A camera hidden among ordinary household items. Digital evidence. Blood evidence. Conflicting statements. And a suspect whose story would continue changing. The world would soon learn about the final hours of Travis Alexander. But before the courtroom, before the media attention, before the accusations became national news, there was only a single question. What happened inside that house on June 4, 2008? The answer would expose a disturbing story of love, rejection, obsession, and violence. And for the people who loved Travis, the hardest part was knowing that the man who had spent his life bringing encouragement and positivity to others had died in a place where he should have felt safest. His own home. For several days after June 4, 2008, the home of Travis Alexander sat quietly in Mesa, Arizona. From the outside, nothing appeared unusual. The neighborhood continued its daily rhythm. Cars passed along familiar streets. People walked through the area without knowing that behind the walls of one ordinary-looking house, a devastating crime had already taken place. Inside, however, time had stopped. The life Travis had built remained frozen in place. The objects around him still reflected the person he was before tragedy entered his home. A place that once represented independence and achievement had become a silent reminder that something terrible had happened. And for the people who cared about Travis, the growing silence surrounding him became impossible to ignore. Travis was not the type of person who simply disappeared. He was someone who stayed connected. Someone who responded to messages. Someone who showed up when people expected him. His friends knew his personality well. They knew his habits. They knew that if Travis made a commitment, he honored it. So when he failed to appear at important meetings and stopped communicating, concern quickly replaced confusion. At first, people tried to explain it. Maybe he was busy. Maybe his phone was not working. Maybe something unexpected had happened. But as the hours passed, those explanations became harder to believe. The silence felt wrong. The people closest to him began contacting one another. They exchanged messages. They asked questions. They tried to figure out where Travis was. The more they talked, the more uncomfortable the situation became. This was not normal. Something had happened. Eventually, a group of friends decided they needed to check his home. They were not expecting to discover a crime scene. They were not expecting to find the person they cared about gone forever. They were simply looking for Travis. They wanted to know why he had vanished. But when they entered the house on June 9, 2008, they found an answer that would change their lives permanently. Inside the bathroom, they discovered the body of Travis Alexander. The shock was immediate. The person they knew as energetic, optimistic, and full of plans was gone. The reality was impossible to process. A man who had spent so much time motivating others was now the center of a tragedy that no one could understand. The discovery of Travis's body immediately transformed the case from a missing person concern into a homicide investigation. Police were called. Investigators arrived. The quiet home became filled with officers, detectives, and forensic specialists searching for answers. Every murder investigation begins with questions. Who was responsible? Why did this happen? Was the victim targeted? Was it random? Was someone close involved? In Travis Alexander's case, one detail quickly became clear. This was not a random act of violence. The condition of the scene suggested a deeply personal attack. Investigators saw evidence that Travis had suffered a brutal assault. The injuries indicated extreme violence. The attack was not consistent with a simple confrontation that had accidentally escalated. Instead, detectives believed the person responsible had intense emotions connected to the victim. Someone had entered Travis's private space. Someone had been close enough to know him. Someone had been trusted. And that immediately changed the direction of the investigation. Detectives began examining Travis's personal life. They looked at his friendships, his professional relationships, his romantic history. They wanted to understand who had access to him and who might have had a reason to harm him. Slowly, one relationship became more important than the others. The relationship with Jodi Arias. Investigators learned that Jodi and Travis had a complicated romantic history. They had met in 2006. They had developed a strong connection. They had dated. They had shared intimate moments. Even after their breakup, they continued communicating. This information immediately raised questions. Why was Jodi still involved in Travis's life? Why had she been at his home shortly before his death? What exactly was happening between them during the final days? As detectives began searching for answers, they discovered evidence that would dramatically change the investigation. One of the most important pieces of evidence came from a digital camera. At first, it appeared to be an ordinary object. A simple device used to capture memories. But inside that camera was a timeline. A record of the final moments before Travis was killed. Investigators discovered that the camera contained photographs taken shortly before the murder. The images showed Travis alive. They showed him inside his home. They showed that Jodi had been there. The photographs were significant because they directly contradicted the possibility that Jodi had not been involved. They placed her at the location. They connected her to the victim shortly before the crime. But the camera contained even more questions. Some photographs had been deleted. Investigators worked to recover the missing data. What they found would become one of the most talked about elements of the entire case. The images helped establish a sequence of events. They showed the moments before everything changed. They created a digital timeline that investigators could analyze. In modern criminal investigations, technology often becomes a silent witness. A phone. A computer. A camera. A message. Objects that appear meaningless can suddenly reveal hidden truths. In the Travis Alexander case, the camera became one of those witnesses. It could not speak. It could not explain what happened. But it could show moments that would later become impossible to ignore. Investigators also discovered another crucial piece of evidence at the scene. A bloody handprint. The print contained biological evidence that connected Jodi Arias to the crime scene. The physical evidence created a growing connection between Jodi and the murder. But the evidence was only one part of the investigation. The words people say after a crime can sometimes reveal as much as the evidence itself. And Jodi Arias' statements would soon become one of the most controversial parts of the case. When investigators began questioning her, she did not immediately admit involvement. Instead, her explanation changed over time. At first, she denied being present at Travis's home. She claimed she had nothing to do with his death. Then, as investigators presented more evidence, another explanation appeared. She suggested that two unknown intruders had entered the house and killed Travis. According to this version of events, she had somehow escaped while Travis became the victim. But investigators found problems with that story. The evidence did not support it. The timeline did not support it. The physical evidence did not support it. Eventually, Jodi changed her explanation again. She admitted that she had been there. She admitted that she had killed Travis. But she claimed it happened in self-defense. She argued that Travis had attacked her, and that she had fought for her life. The investigation had now entered a new phase. It was no longer simply about identifying the person responsible. Police knew who they believed had killed Travis. The question became, why? What had happened between two people who once shared affection? What caused a relationship to end in such violence? Was this an act of fear? Was it an act of anger? Was it something planned? These questions would become the center of the courtroom battle years later. But in the days after Travis's death, investigators were still collecting pieces. The camera. The fingerprints. The statements. The relationship history. Each piece added another layer to a disturbing story. A story where the person closest to the victim became the person accused of destroying his life. For Travis's family and friends, the pain was not only losing him. It was trying to understand how this could have happened. How someone who had shared laughter and memories with Travis could become connected to such a violent crime. How a relationship that began with attraction could end with a courtroom, a prison sentence, and a lifetime of questions. The house in Mesa had revealed its secrets slowly. But investigators knew they had only uncovered the beginning. The deeper they looked into Travis and Jodi's relationship, the more complicated the story became. And soon, the investigation would move beyond the crime scene. It would move into the past. Into messages. Into conversations. Into the moments when love began changing into something much darker. Because before the final attack, there had been warning signs. And investigators were determined to find them. The murder scene inside Travis Alexander's home had given investigators something they desperately needed in the early hours of the case: evidence. But evidence alone does not always reveal the whole story. A crime scene can show what happened. It can show where something happened. It can show how someone died. But it cannot always explain why. And in the case of Travis Alexander, the question of why would become the most difficult mystery to solve. Why would someone who once shared affection and intimacy with Travis turn against him? Why would a relationship that began with attraction and excitement end with such extreme violence? To answer those questions, detectives had to look beyond the bathroom where Travis was found. They had to look into the history between two people. They had to examine every conversation, every message, every interaction, and every moment that revealed the changing nature of their relationship. The investigation quickly focused on Jodi Arias. Not because of a single piece of evidence. Not because of a single accusation. But because the more investigators learned, the more difficult it became to separate Jodi from the events surrounding Travis's death. She had been connected to him. She had been inside his home. She had been with him shortly before he was killed. And her explanations continued changing. For detectives, changing stories are often significant. People may forget details. People may become confused under stress. But when an explanation changes dramatically, investigators naturally begin asking why. What is the person hiding? What are they afraid of? What part of the story does not fit? From the beginning, Jodi's statements created questions. When Travis was first reported missing and later discovered dead, investigators began contacting people connected to his life. They interviewed friends. They reviewed his recent activities. They examined his relationships. And as they followed the timeline, they discovered that Jodi had been one of the last known people to see Travis alive. That detail immediately placed her under intense attention. Jodi initially insisted she was not responsible. She maintained that she had nothing to do with Travis's death. But investigators continued building the case. They looked at physical evidence. They analyzed digital information. They reconstructed the final days before the murder. Slowly, the story they were uncovering became more complicated. One of the most important parts of the investigation involved understanding the relationship between Travis and Jodi after their breakup. To outsiders, their connection may have appeared confusing. They were no longer a traditional couple. Yet they continued communicating. They continued seeing each other. They continued sharing personal moments. This created a situation where emotions remained unresolved. For investigators, understanding that emotional landscape became essential. A murder does not happen in a vacuum. There is usually a history, a conflict, a motivation. Something that pushes a person toward a decision that changes everything. The prosecution would later argue that the answer was jealousy and obsession. They claimed Jodi struggled to accept that Travis was moving forward without her. They argued that she wanted to maintain control over a relationship that Travis was trying to leave behind. Friends of Travis described moments that they believed showed increasing tension. They told investigators that Travis had expressed concerns about Jodi's behavior. They believed he was uncomfortable with some of her actions and was trying to create distance. But despite those concerns, the connection between Travis and Jodi continued. That complicated relationship became one of the most important parts of the investigation. Because the person accused of killing Travis was not simply someone who knew him. She was someone who had once been welcomed into his life. Someone who had shared private moments with him. Someone who knew his personality and his routines. That closeness made the crime even more disturbing. Investigators also examined Jodi's movements around the time of the murder. They wanted to know how she traveled, where she went, what she did afterward. Every small detail mattered. A person's actions before and after a crime can reveal intention. A person's behavior can sometimes tell a story that words cannot. The investigation also focused heavily on the digital evidence. The camera discovered at Travis's home became a major piece of the case. The images created a timeline that investigators could study. They showed Travis alive shortly before his death. They showed Jodi's presence. They challenged parts of her earlier statements. Digital evidence has a unique power in criminal investigations. Unlike memories, which can change over time, digital records often preserve moments exactly as they occurred. A timestamp does not forget. A photograph does not reinterpret. A file does not change its story. The camera became a silent witness. It preserved moments that neither Travis nor Jodi could explain anymore. Investigators also examined DNA evidence. Biological material found at the scene was compared with samples connected to the people involved. The evidence further strengthened the connection between Jodi and the crime scene. But even with evidence building against her, Jodi continued defending her version of events. Her explanations shifted. First, she said she was not there. Then she suggested strangers had committed the murder. Later, she admitted being present but claimed she acted in self-defense. For investigators, these changes were extremely important. A person who tells the truth usually does not need to repeatedly rebuild the story. Each new explanation raised more questions. Why deny being there if she had nothing to hide? Why create a story about unknown attackers? Why change the explanation only after evidence connected her to the scene? The investigation became a battle between evidence and explanation. The evidence created a clear path. But Jodi's statements created confusion. As the case gained attention, the media began following every development. The public became fascinated by the details. A young, successful man. A complicated relationship. A shocking murder. A suspect whose story continued changing. The case had all the elements that captured public attention. But behind the headlines was a grieving family trying to understand the loss of Travis. For them, this was not entertainment. It was not a television story. It was the death of someone they loved. A person who had plans. A person who had dreams. A person who should have had decades ahead of him. While the public debated the details, investigators continued their work. They were not trying to create a dramatic story. They were trying to reconstruct reality. They examined phone records. They studied photographs. They reviewed conversations. They spoke with people who knew Travis and Jody. Piece by piece, they attempted to rebuild the final chapter of Travis Alexander's life. And as they did, a disturbing pattern began to appear. The relationship that once seemed romantic had become increasingly complicated. The affection had been replaced by conflict. The connection had become a source of tension. The breakup that should have created distance instead created a situation where neither person fully moved on. And investigators believed that unresolved emotions played a critical role in what happened. But even with a growing amount of evidence, one major challenge remained. Proving exactly what happened inside Travis Alexander's home. The prosecution needed more than suspicion. They needed a complete picture. They needed to show not only that Jody was connected to the crime, but that the murder was intentional. That it was not an accident. That it was not self-defense. That it was a deliberate act. The investigation continued for months. Every discovery brought them closer to the truth. Every piece of evidence created a clearer image of the events surrounding June 4, 2008. And eventually, the case reached the moment that would change everything. A moment when investigators would make a decision. A moment when Jody Arias would officially become the person accused of killing Travis Alexander. The evidence had been collected. The timeline had been reconstructed. The story had been examined. Now, it was time for justice to begin. Every major criminal investigation reaches a point where scattered pieces of evidence begin forming a clear picture. At the beginning, investigators often see only fragments. A crime scene. A witness statement. A suspicious detail. A question that has no answer. But as detectives continue searching, those fragments slowly connect. A photograph becomes a timeline. A message becomes a motive. A contradiction becomes a sign of deception. In the case of Travis Alexander, that moment came when investigators realized that the story surrounding his death was no longer a mystery of unknown attackers. The evidence was pointing toward someone who had once been close to him. Jody Arias. But reaching that conclusion required investigators to carefully separate facts from emotions. The case was filled with complicated feelings. There was a relationship. There was history. There were conflicting stories. And there was a victim whose life had ended in a way that demanded answers. The first major breakthrough came from the evidence that Jody herself had left behind. The digital camera found inside Travis's home became one of the most important pieces of the investigation. At first, it seemed like an ordinary personal item. A camera used to capture memories. A device that should have contained simple photographs. But when investigators examined the contents, they discovered something much more significant. They found a timeline. The photographs showed Travis alive shortly before the murder. They showed that Jody had been present inside the home. They showed that the two had spent time together shortly before the violent attack. The images challenged Jody's first statements. They made it impossible to maintain the idea that she had not been there. The camera became a silent witness. It did not accuse. It did not explain. It simply showed what happened before the tragedy. For investigators, this was a critical moment. Because crimes are often built on uncertainty. Suspects can deny. Stories can change. Memories can become unclear. But physical evidence creates a foundation. The photographs created a connection between Jodi and the final moments of Travis's life. Then came the biological evidence. At the crime scene, investigators discovered a bloody handprint. The analysis connected the evidence to Jodi Arias. This was another major step forward. The case was no longer based only on relationship history or suspicion. There was now physical evidence linking her to the scene. But perhaps the most damaging evidence against Jodi came from her own words. During the investigation, Jodi gave different explanations for what happened. At first, she denied being present. She claimed she had not been involved. But as investigators presented evidence, that explanation became impossible to maintain. Then came another story. She suggested that unknown attackers had entered Travis's home and killed him. According to this version, she had somehow escaped while Travis was murdered. But investigators found problems with that explanation. The evidence did not support the existence of unknown attackers. The timeline did not match. The physical evidence did not match. The story appeared to be changing because the facts were becoming harder to avoid. Eventually, Jodi admitted that she had been at Travis's home. But she presented a completely different explanation. She claimed that she had killed Travis in self-defense. According to her account, Travis had become violent toward her, and she had acted because she feared for her life. This became the central argument of her defense. The issue was no longer whether Jodi was involved. It was whether she was responsible for a planned murder or whether she had reacted to an immediate threat. The prosecution saw the situation differently. They argued that the violence against Travis was not the result of panic. They argued it was deliberate. They pointed to the severity of the attack. They pointed to the evidence. They pointed to the changing stories. To prosecutors, these were not the actions of someone trying to survive. They were the actions of someone trying to hide responsibility. As investigators continued building the case, they also looked deeper into the relationship between Travis and Jodi. They wanted to understand the emotional background behind the crime. Because the question was not simply, who killed Travis Alexander? The evidence was increasingly answering that. The deeper question was, why? What transformed a relationship that once appeared romantic into a deadly confrontation? Investigators examined the months before the murder. They looked at messages exchanged between Travis and Jodi. They spoke with friends who had witnessed their relationship. They learned about the tension that had developed after the breakup. According to people close to Travis, he wanted to move forward. He wanted to focus on his future. He wanted a relationship that matched his beliefs and goals. But Jodi continued remaining connected to him. The prosecution would later argue that she struggled to accept losing him. They believed Travis's decision to move on created feelings of rejection and anger. They believed the murder was motivated by jealousy and a desire for control. The case began attracting national attention. People across the country became fascinated by the details. A young man with a promising future. A former romantic partner. A series of changing explanations. A crime scene filled with evidence. The public wanted to understand what happened. But the investigation was not based on public opinion. It was based on facts. And the facts were becoming stronger. By July 2008, authorities had gathered enough evidence to move forward. Jodi Arias was arrested and charged in connection with Travis Alexander's murder. The arrest marked a turning point. The investigation phase had ended. The legal battle was beginning. But even after her arrest, the questions surrounding the case remained. Was Jodi a person who had lost control in a moment of fear? Or was she someone who carefully planned a violent act? The answer would eventually be decided in court. But before the trial began, the prosecution and defense prepared for a battle over two completely different versions of reality. The prosecution would present Travis as a victim of obsession. A man who wanted to move forward but became trapped in a dangerous relationship. They would argue that the evidence showed planning, anger, and revenge. The defense would present a different image. They would argue that Jodi had been pushed into a desperate situation. They would argue that the violence was not planned but the result of fear. Two stories. Two explanations. One tragic death. The courtroom would eventually become the place where those stories collided. But before that happened, investigators had already reached their conclusion. The person responsible for Travis Alexander's death was not a stranger. Not an unknown attacker. Not someone from outside his life. It was someone who had once been invited into his home. Someone who had shared his personal world. Someone who knew his hopes and his dreams. And that realization made the case even more disturbing. Because the greatest betrayal was not only that Travis Alexander had been killed. It was that the person accused of killing him had once been someone he trusted. The investigation had uncovered the evidence. The arrest had been made. The next chapter would move from the streets of Mesa, Arizona, into a courtroom where every photograph, every message, and every word would be examined. A courtroom where the world would finally hear the full story of what happened between Travis Alexander and Jodi Arias. When Jodi Arias entered the courtroom in 2013, the murder of Travis Alexander was no longer only an investigation. It had become a national spectacle. For nearly 5 years, people had followed the case through news reports, interviews, and public discussions. The questions surrounding Travis's death had captured widespread attention. How did a relationship that began with attraction and affection end with murder? Was Jodi Arias a victim of a dangerous situation, as she claimed? Or was she the person responsible for a carefully planned act of violence? The courtroom would become the place where those questions were finally tested. But behind the cameras and public attention was a much more painful reality. A family had lost someone they loved. Friends had lost someone who had once filled their lives with laughter and encouragement. And every day of testimony meant returning to the final moments of Travis Alexander's life. For the prosecution, the case was about one central idea. Travis Alexander was murdered by someone who knew him, someone who had access to him, and someone who had a powerful motive to harm him. For the defense, the story was completely different. They argued that Jodi Arias was not a cold-blooded killer. They argued that she was a woman who had experienced fear and violence and reacted in a moment of desperation. The trial would become a battle between two versions of the same relationship. One side described obsession. The other described survival. The jury would have to decide which story matched the evidence. From the beginning, prosecutors focused heavily on the timeline. They wanted jurors to understand what happened before, during, and after June 4, 2008. They presented evidence showing that Jodi had traveled to Travis's home. They presented the photographs recovered from the digital camera. They presented forensic evidence collected from the scene. Each piece added another layer to their argument. They claimed that Travis's death was not a sudden accident. They argued that the attack required intention. The prosecution highlighted the nature of Travis's injuries. They argued that the level of violence demonstrated anger and personal motivation. In their view, this was not someone acting out of immediate fear. It was someone taking revenge. The defense challenged that interpretation. They attempted to create doubt about the prosecution's timeline and motives. They argued that the relationship between Travis and Jodi was more complicated than prosecutors suggested. They portrayed Jodi as someone who had experienced emotional and physical trauma. They argued that her actions were not the result of planning but a response to a threatening situation. The trial became especially focused on Jodi Arias herself. Her testimony lasted many days and became one of the most discussed parts of the entire case. Millions of people followed her statements. Every answer, every explanation, every emotional reaction. The courtroom became a place where her credibility was examined under intense pressure. During questioning, prosecutors challenged her changing stories. They returned repeatedly to the different explanations she had given over the years. First, she said she was not at Travis's home. Then, she suggested unknown attackers were responsible. Later, she admitted killing Travis but claimed self-defense. Prosecutors argued that these changes showed deception. They asked a simple question. If the truth was self-defense, why deny being there in the beginning? The defense attempted to explain those changes by arguing that Jodi had been afraid. They suggested that fear and trauma affected how she responded during questioning. But prosecutors believed the changing stories were evidence of guilt. The photographs became one of the most powerful elements of the trial. The camera created a visual record of Travis's final moments alive. The images showed the relationship between Travis and Jodi shortly before his death. They showed that the two were together. They showed that Jodi had been inside the home. For the prosecution, those photographs helped establish the timeline. For many watching the trial, they also represented something emotionally difficult. They captured Travis during the last moments of his life before everything changed. A person who did not know what was coming. A person who was still living normally. A person who had no idea that those ordinary moments would later become evidence in a murder trial. The forensic evidence also played a major role. Experts explained the findings from the crime scene. They discussed DNA evidence. They discussed the injuries Travis suffered. They discussed the physical details that investigators had collected. The prosecution argued that the evidence created a clear picture. The defense attempted to challenge parts of that picture. Every detail became important. Every piece of evidence was questioned. Every conclusion was debated. The trial lasted for weeks, and public interest continued growing. People across the country became divided. Some believed Jodi Arias was guilty and had manipulated everyone around her. Others questioned whether the entire story had been fully understood. The media attention became overwhelming. The case was discussed on television programs, online forums, and social media platforms. Jodi's personality became a major topic of conversation. People analyzed her behavior. They analyzed her words. They analyzed her emotions. But inside the courtroom, the focus remained on evidence. Not popularity. Not public opinion. Not speculation. The jury had one responsibility. Determine what happened to Travis Alexander. As the trial progressed, the prosecution continued building its argument that the murder was planned. They pointed to evidence suggesting preparation. They argued that Jodi's actions before and after the killing demonstrated intention. They argued that the attack was not an uncontrollable moment. It was a decision. The defense continued maintaining that the situation was misunderstood. They argued that Jodi's actions needed to be viewed through the lens of fear and survival. The contrast between the two sides could not have been greater. One side saw a calculated killer. The other saw a frightened woman. But eventually, the jury had to look beyond emotion. They had to examine the evidence. They had to determine whether the prosecution had proven its case beyond a reasonable doubt. After weeks of testimony, arguments, and emotional moments, the case moved toward its conclusion. The final argument summarized everything the jury had heard. The prosecution returned to Travis. They reminded jurors of the person whose life had been taken. A man with dreams. A man with a future. A man whose life ended inside his own home. They argued that justice required accountability. The defense reminded jurors that the burden of proof belonged to the prosecution. They argued that unanswered questions remained. They asked jurors to consider another possibility. Then came the moment everyone had been waiting for. The jury entered deliberation. After years of investigation. After months of preparation. After weeks inside the courtroom. The fate of Jodi Arias was now in the hands of 12 people. On May 8, 2013, the jury reached its decision. The courtroom became silent as the verdict was read. Jodi Arias was found guilty of first-degree murder in the death of Travis Alexander. For Travis's family and friends, the verdict represented a moment they had waited years to reach. The legal system had answered the question that had haunted them since June 2008. Who was responsible for Travis's death? But the case was not completely finished. A guilty verdict answered one question. It did not erase the pain. It did not bring Travis back. And it did not end the emotional battle surrounding the case. The next stage would determine Jodi Arias's punishment. The courtroom would once again become the center of attention. This time, the question would not be about guilt. It would be about whether Jodi Arias should spend the rest of her life in prison or face the ultimate punishment. The final chapter of the trial was about to begin. And the world would once again watch as the justice system decided the fate of the woman convicted of killing Travis Alexander. The verdict had been delivered. After years of uncertainty, investigations, arguments, and painful memories, the courtroom had finally reached a conclusion. Jodi Arias was guilty of first-degree murder. For many people watching the case, that moment represented the end of a long search for answers. But for those who truly knew Travis Alexander, there was no sense of complete closure. Because a verdict could punish the person responsible. A verdict could acknowledge the crime. A verdict could establish the truth in the eyes of the law. But a verdict could not restore what had been taken. It could not bring Travis home. It could not return the future he had planned. It could not erase the pain carried by the people who loved him. Behind every famous criminal case is a human story. And behind the name that appeared in newspapers and television broadcasts was a family trying to survive the loss of someone they never expected to lose. Travis Alexander was 30 years old when his life ended. 30 years old. An age when many people are still building. Still discovering. Still creating the future they imagined. He had dreams that would never happen. Conversations that would never take place. Places he would never visit. People he would never meet. His story stopped suddenly, but the lives of those who loved him continued. And continuing without someone can sometimes be its own kind of pain. For Travis's friends, memories became both a comfort and a reminder. They remembered the person before the tragedy. They remembered the man who laughed. The man who motivated others. The man who believed in personal growth. The man who made people feel like they mattered. Those memories became important because the public often sees only the final chapter of a victim's life. They see the crime. They see the investigation. They see the courtroom. But the victim existed long before the crime happened. Travis was not simply a name connected to a murder case. He was a person who had a history. A personality. A purpose. And for those who knew him, preserving that memory became important. At the same time, the aftermath of the case created a completely different reality for Jodi Arias. The woman who had once lived a relatively private life became one of the most recognizable criminal defendants in America. Her name became associated with one of the most controversial murder trials of the decade. The public fascination surrounding the case continued even after the guilty verdict. People analyzed the evidence. They debated the relationship. They discussed the psychology behind the crime. They tried to understand how a connection that began with affection could end with death. The case raised uncomfortable questions about relationships, obsession, and emotional control. How does affection become possession? When does attachment become unhealthy? How does someone move from wanting another person's love to wanting control over their life? These questions became central to the public discussion surrounding the case. Many experts who studied the case focused on the concept of obsessive attachment. The idea that one person can become emotionally dependent on another person to the point where rejection feels unbearable. In ordinary relationships, breakups can cause sadness, anger, and grief. Those feelings are painful but temporary. However, when emotions become connected with control, entitlement, and refusal to accept reality, the situation can become dangerous. The prosecution argued that this was what happened between Jodi and Travis. They believed that Travis's attempt to move forward was viewed by Jodi as a personal rejection. They argued that she could not accept losing the relationship and that her emotions eventually transformed into something destructive. The defense presented a different interpretation. They argued that the relationship was more complicated. They argued that Jodi's actions were connected to fear and trauma. But after the conviction, the legal system had reached its conclusion. The jury had decided that the evidence showed responsibility for Travis's death. The next major question was punishment. The sentencing phase became another highly watched part of the case. The possibility of the death penalty was discussed. The prosecution argued that the crime was especially cruel and deserved the harshest possible punishment. They emphasized the violence of the attack and the suffering Travis experienced. The defense argued for a lesser sentence. They attempted to present Jodi's life history and circumstances as factors the court should consider. The sentencing process revealed another difficult reality of criminal justice. A trial does not only determine what happened. It also forces society to decide how accountability should be measured. What punishment fits a crime? Can any sentence truly represent the loss of a human life? These are questions without easy answers. Eventually, Jodi Arias received a sentence of life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. The final legal chapter had arrived. The woman convicted of killing Travis Alexander would spend the rest of her life in prison. But the story of Travis did not end there. His name remained connected to discussions about domestic relationships, emotional manipulation, and the warning signs that can exist before violence occurs. The case became an example often examined by people studying criminal behavior. Not because Travis's death was simply a dramatic mystery, but because it revealed how complicated human relationships can become. A person can appear loving in one moment and destructive in another. A relationship can begin with excitement and end in tragedy. A person can believe they know someone completely and later discover a side they never imagined existed. The tragedy of Travis Alexander also reminded many people about the importance of recognizing concerning behaviors in relationships. Extreme jealousy. Attempts to control another person. Difficulty accepting boundaries. Refusing to respect separation. These behaviors may appear as emotional conflicts at first, but they can become warning signs when they continue and intensify. Of course, every difficult relationship does not lead to violence. But understanding unhealthy patterns can help people recognize situations that may require attention or support. Years after the murder, the case continues to attract attention. Documentaries have been produced. Books have been written. Television programs have analyzed the evidence. People continue debating the details. But beyond the fascination surrounding the trial, the most important part of the story remains Travis himself. A man whose life was interrupted. A man who had people who loved him. A man who had plans that would never become reality. The danger in famous true crime cases is that the victim can sometimes become secondary to the person accused of the crime. The suspect becomes the focus. The trial becomes the story. The controversy becomes the conversation. But Travis Alexander was not simply a character in someone else's story. He was the center of his own life. He was someone who mattered before the tragedy. And remembering that is perhaps the most important form of justice that remains. Because the final image of Travis should not only be the crime scene. It should be the person he was before. The person who smiled. The person who encouraged others. The person who dreamed about the future. The person whose life meant something to many people. The murder of Travis Alexander became one of America's most famous true crime cases because it contained mystery, emotion, and controversy. But underneath all of that was a simple and heartbreaking truth. A life was lost. A family was changed forever. And a man who believed he had many more years ahead of him never got the chance to live them. His story continues because people still ask how such a tragedy could happen. How love could become obsession. How trust could become betrayal. How an ordinary day could become someone's last. And perhaps the most haunting lesson from the case is that sometimes the greatest tragedies do not begin with strangers. Sometimes they begin with someone who was once welcomed inside. The murder of Travis Alexander was not only a criminal investigation. It was also a disturbing study of human emotions pushed to an extreme. Long after the courtroom doors closed and the verdict was delivered, people continued trying to understand one question. How could a relationship that began with attraction and affection end with such devastating violence? There was no simple answer. Human behavior is rarely simple. People are shaped by their experiences, their beliefs, their emotions, and the choices they make in moments of conflict. But in the case of Travis Alexander and Jodi Arias, investigators, psychologists, and observers repeatedly returned to one central theme: the transformation of attachment into obsession. At the beginning, Travis and Jodi's relationship appeared like many other relationships. Two people met. They became interested in each other. They shared personal experiences. They created memories. There was excitement. There was attraction. There was the feeling that something meaningful was developing. But relationships are not defined only by how they begin. They are also defined by how people respond when things change. And that was where the relationship between Travis and Jodi became increasingly complicated. Travis eventually decided that their romantic connection was not the future he wanted. He wanted something different. He wanted stability. He wanted a relationship aligned with his long-term goals. For him, ending the relationship was a difficult but necessary decision. But for Jodi, prosecutors argued, the breakup represented something much deeper. They argued that she did not simply lose a boyfriend. She lost the future she imagined. She lost the role she wanted to have in Travis's life. And that emotional loss became something she struggled to accept. This distinction is important. Because heartbreak is a universal human experience. Almost everyone experiences rejection at some point. Almost everyone understands the pain of losing someone they care about. But most people eventually accept that pain. They process it. They heal. They move forward. The danger begins when a person cannot accept the reality of separation. When the desire to reconnect becomes a need to regain control. When another person's independence feels like a personal attack. According to the prosecution's theory, this was the emotional path that led to Travis's murder. They argued that Jodi's feelings evolved from affection into possession. The relationship was no longer about sharing a life. It became about preventing Travis from moving on. This idea of emotional possession became one of the most discussed aspects of the case. A healthy relationship requires two people who choose each other freely. Both people have their own identity, their own choices, their own boundaries. But an unhealthy attachment can create a different mindset. Instead of thinking, I want this person to be happy, the thought becomes, I need this person to stay with me. The difference may seem small, but psychologically, it represents a major shift. The first comes from love. The second comes from control. Throughout the investigation and trial, prosecutors argued that Jodi had difficulty accepting boundaries. They pointed to moments where they believed she attempted to remain connected to Travis even after he wanted distance. They argued that she continued seeking a place in his life even as he tried to move forward. The continued contact between them became a significant part of the case, because it created a confusing emotional environment. They were no longer a traditional couple, but they were not completely separated. There were still conversations, still meetings, still emotional connections. That unclear space can be extremely difficult for people who struggle with rejection. A breakup with clear separation creates a painful but understandable reality. But a breakup where contact continues can create hope. And hope, when disconnected from reality, can become dangerous. Another important aspect of the case was jealousy. Jealousy itself is a normal human emotion. People can feel insecure. People can fear losing someone. People can compare themselves to others. But jealousy becomes dangerous when it turns into entitlement. When someone believes they have the right to control another person's choices. When another person's happiness becomes unacceptable because it does not include them. The prosecution argued that Travis's attempts to move forward created intense emotional reactions from Jodi. They believed she could not accept the idea that Travis might build a future with someone else. The murder, according to their argument, was the final result of that inability to let go. The defense presented a different picture. They argued that Jodi had experienced fear and trauma. They argued that her actions needed to be viewed through the circumstances she described. But the jury ultimately rejected that explanation. After reviewing the evidence, they concluded that Jodi was responsible for Travis's death. The case also raised questions about manipulation. During the trial, many people focused on Jodi's changing explanations. The different versions of events became a major point of discussion. Investigators argued that these changes showed an attempt to avoid responsibility. From a psychological perspective, changing narratives after a serious event can sometimes be a way for someone to protect themselves from consequences. People may create explanations that allow them to avoid facing painful truths. They may attempt to control how others perceive them. They may reshape reality to reduce personal responsibility. The prosecution believed that this happened throughout the investigation. They argued that Jodi adapted her story whenever new evidence made the previous version impossible. Another reason the case attracted so much attention was the contrast between appearances and reality. Many people who knew Travis described him as positive, friendly, and successful. Many people who encountered Jodi before the crime did not see her as someone capable of murder. This contrast created a disturbing question. How well do we really know the people around us? Sometimes, individuals reveal only the parts of themselves they want others to see. A person can appear charming. They can appear caring. They can appear trustworthy. But hidden emotions, unresolved conflicts, and unhealthy patterns may exist beneath the surface. This does not mean every difficult person is dangerous. It does not mean every troubled relationship will become violent. But cases like Travis Alexander's demonstrate why certain behaviors should not be ignored. Extreme jealousy. Attempts to control. Refusing to respect boundaries. threats or intimidation. A pattern of emotional instability. These behaviors can become warning signs when they intensify. The tragedy of Travis Alexander was not simply that he met the wrong person. It was that a relationship he once viewed as meaningful became a situation he could no longer safely escape. The person accused of killing him was not an unknown enemy. She was someone who knew his personality. Someone who knew his habits. Someone who had once been close to him. That betrayal became one of the most painful aspects of the case. For Travis's family and friends, the question was not only, why did he die? It was also, how could someone who knew him do this? That question remains one of the most difficult parts of any crime involving someone close to the victim. When a stranger commits violence, people often search for explanations outside the victim's life. But when violence comes from someone trusted, the entire understanding of the relationship changes. Memories become complicated. Past moments are viewed differently. Every interaction is reconsidered. The Travis Alexander case continues to be studied because it represents more than a murder. It represents the darkest possibility of emotional obsession. It shows how a relationship built on attraction can become dangerous when one person cannot accept losing control. But above all, it reminds us that the center of this story is not the person accused of the crime. It is Travis Alexander. A man who had dreams. A man who had goals. A man who believed he had a future. His life was not defined by the person who took it away. His life was defined by the years before that moment. The friendships he created. The people he helped. The memories he left behind. And perhaps the greatest tragedy is that the world learned his name because of how he died, when he deserved to be remembered because of how he lived. Years after the courtroom cameras stopped recording and the headlines began to fade, the murder of Travis Alexander remained a case that continued to live in public memory. Some criminal cases disappear with time. The names involved slowly become forgotten. The details become distant. The world moves on. But the case of Travis Alexander and Jodi Arias remained different. It continued to be discussed. Continued to be analyzed. Continued to raise difficult questions about relationships, obsession, justice, and the human capacity for violence. Part of the reason was the extraordinary amount of attention surrounding the trial. The public watched as a private relationship was exposed in front of the entire country. Messages that were once personal became evidence. Photographs that were once private became courtroom exhibits. Memories between two people became pieces of a legal puzzle. The trial transformed a relationship that had existed behind closed doors into a story examined by millions. But beyond the fascination surrounding the case was something much more serious. A man had lost his life. And the people who loved Travis Alexander had to continue living with that reality long after the cameras disappeared. For Travis's family and friends, the most important part of his story was never the controversy. It was the person he was before everything happened. They remembered his personality. They remembered his humor. They remembered the way he encouraged others. They remembered the energy he brought into their lives. Those memories became a way of protecting Travis's identity from being completely consumed by the crime. Because one of the unfortunate realities of famous murder cases is that victims can sometimes become remembered only through the way they died. Their final moments become more familiar than their entire lives. Their suffering becomes more recognized than their achievements. But Travis Alexander was not simply a victim. He was a person who had spent 30 years creating relationships and leaving impressions on others. He was someone who had goals. Someone who had faith. Someone who believed in becoming better. The tragedy was that the world learned his name because of his death instead of because of his life. The case also changed the way many people viewed relationships and emotional warning signs. The story forced people to examine difficult questions. How can someone recognize when a relationship becomes unhealthy? When does strong emotion become obsession? When does love become control? These questions are complicated because harmful relationships rarely begin with obvious danger. They often begin with the same things that many healthy relationships begin with: attention, affection, excitement, a feeling of being understood. That was one reason the case had such a powerful impact. The beginning of Travis and Jodi's relationship did not appear unusual. There was no obvious sign that their connection would end in tragedy. There were moments of happiness, moments of closeness, moments that appeared meaningful. The transformation from affection to violence was not something most people would have predicted. And that uncertainty is what made the case so disturbing. It challenged the belief that people can always recognize danger immediately. Sometimes warning signs appear gradually. Sometimes people explain away uncomfortable behavior because they remember the good moments. Sometimes emotional attachment makes it difficult to see a situation clearly. The case also became widely discussed because of the role of technology in modern investigations. The digital camera that captured Travis's final moments became a symbol of how technology can preserve evidence. In previous generations, investigators often depended heavily on witness memories and physical evidence alone. But in the modern world, digital information can create a detailed record of events. Photographs, messages, phone records, online activity. Technology can become an invisible witness. It can reveal details that people may try to hide. In Travis Alexander's case, digital evidence played a major role in reconstructing what happened before his death. The camera did not explain emotions. It did not reveal thoughts. But it provided a timeline. It showed that the final moments of Travis's life were connected to the person investigators believed responsible. The case also sparked conversations about media coverage of criminal trials. Many people became fascinated with the details of the courtroom. They followed testimony closely. They analyzed every statement. They debated the personalities involved. But this intense attention created another difficult question. When does public interest become entertainment? True crime stories often exist in a complicated space. People want to understand why crimes happen. They want to learn from tragedy. They want answers. But behind every case are real people who continue experiencing the consequences. For Travis's loved ones, the case was not a television event. It was their reality. Every article, every discussion, every reminder of the trial brought back memories of someone they lost. That is an important part of understanding true crime. The victim is not a character. The victim is not a plot point. The victim was a real person whose absence continues affecting others. The legacy of Travis Alexander's case also exists in the broader discussion of criminal psychology. Researchers and observers have examined the relationship dynamics involved. They have looked at themes such as attachment, jealousy, emotional dependence, and control. The case became an example of how personal relationships can become complicated environments where emotions become intensified. But while people continue studying the psychology behind the crime, one fact remains unchanged. Understanding a crime does not excuse it. Explaining behavior does not remove responsibility. The legal system reached its conclusion when Jodi Arias was convicted of first-degree murder. The jury determined that the evidence proved she was responsible for Travis's death. She was later sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. The punishment brought a legal ending. But emotional endings are different. For families who lose someone, justice does not mean forgetting. It means carrying the memory forward. It means finding a way to live while accepting that the person they loved will never return. Years after Travis's death, his story continued to represent something larger. It became a reminder of the importance of recognizing unhealthy relationship patterns. It became a reminder that boundaries matter. That respect matters. That a person's inability to accept rejection can have devastating consequences. But most importantly, it became a reminder that every victim has a story beyond the crime. Travis Alexander was a man who wanted to inspire others. He was someone who believed in growth. Someone who wanted to create a meaningful life. His final moments were tragic, but they were only a small part of his existence. The years before June 4, 2008, mattered. The friendships mattered. The memories mattered. The person he was mattered. And perhaps the most powerful way to honor victims of violent crime is not only to remember what happened to them. It is to remember who they were before it happened. Because long before Travis Alexander became the center of a murder investigation, he was simply Travis. A man with dreams. A man with hopes. A man who believed tomorrow would come. A man who never knew that one ordinary day in Arizona would become the final chapter of his life. And that is the part of his story that should never be forgotten.